Thank everyone for coming, especially on this snowy afternoon. So it's really appreciate you coming along to this this second event involving Mark Koyama. So Mark Koyama has several degrees from the University of Oxford and taught at the University of York before moving to the United States, and is now an associate professor at George Mason University. And he's an expert on how the world became rich, as his recent book will show. And today he's going to talk about a component of that kind of overarching research agenda, interrogating the fractured land hypothesis.
Thanks for such a kind introduction, and very happy to be here. Yeah, so this is joint work with Jesus Fernandez Villaverde, Yu Hong Leng, and Tonhui Singh. So this is a big project. We were happy to have it published already, but it's been a major piece of work we spent several years on. And as Nick said, we're investigating the hypothesis that fractured land was one of the key factors that explains the divergence that we observe in this figure in the number of states at either end of Eurasia. So this is from reproduced from a slightly earlier paper we wrote, where we're contrasting the number of states, independent polities in Europe versus China. And note the scale is logarithmic. So by around 1000, there's an order of magnitude more states in Europe than in China. So, and then even though China has not always been one country, it was at some points fragmented during the Warring Kingdoms period, or in the early centuries CE, but in general it's had a far smaller number of polities within it than Europe, and it's had a tendency over time to be a single state more and more often. So unification has been a persistent process in China, fragmentation has been a persistent process in Europe. And why? So that's an observation. Why does it matter? And so it's long been seen as potentially crucial to the differences we observe in different parts of Eurasia in terms of both political outcomes and economic outcomes. So this observation really goes back to Montesquieu and Hume. Hume should be in that long list. It's really that old, and the idea is that China, because it's centralized in a single state, it tends to be more autocratic. So the idea being that their exit vowels in a politically fragmented system, the states compete against each other. If you're a persecuted minority or an intellectual dissident, you can cross the border, go somewhere else, and still be okay. So think about early modern and Enlightenment thinkers like Descartes or Rousseau, who, if they didn't like it in France, could go to Sweden, Dutch Republic, or Geneva. And still write. You can't do that so easily in a single centralized empire. Which Europe had been, of course, under Rome, which is something we're going to touch upon. So people think it matters for things like tax rate, for innovation, for state capacity, for the degree of trade protection, trade policy. Even today, if you think about the contrast between Western policies towards COVID compared to China's, you can trace back some of these differences to this fundamental divergence in the number of polities in a given geographical region. So what causes then the fragmentation in Europe and the consolidation of a single unified regime in China? Well, an answer which again goes back a long way, at least as far as Montesquieu and David Hume, is fractured land. So in an earlier version of this slide, I had the quote from Montesquieu. He attributes Europe's warlikeness to the number of different polities in Europe. David Hume is the one who connects it to political liberty. But in a modern context, Jared Diamond was the guy really responsible for pushing this. So in Guns, Germs and Steel, he observes that there's fractured land in Europe, particularly the Pyrenees, which separate Spain from Spain from France, the Alps, which separate France from Italy, and then the River Rhine and the German forests, which break up the Central European plain. You've got the Carpathian Mountains in the east. So there's sufficient mountains, dense forests, and otherwise rugged terrain, which means that it's difficult for a large empire to dominate Europe compared to other parts of Eurasia, particularly China. But this stretch of land hypothesis has been criticized. So Phil Hoffman wrote a book about the military rise of Europe, and he criticized this by saying, look, on average, China is much more mountainous than Europe. And I'll flick back between these. So this is kind of, from Diamond, the idea that, look, these mountain ranges are breaking up Europe into separate qualities, whereas China, particularly between the Yangtze River and the Yellow River, you've a continuous fertile plain where states can form. But if you compare just topography, actually China has more mountains than Europe. And so to preview the results, what's going to matter though is not really how many mountains you have or how mountainous your land is on average, but the location of mountains. We're going to think about that. So China is 37% has terrain which is defined as being mountainous, compared to only 10% in Europe. Other people, including Peter Turchin, have also made similar points. They've argued that, if fractured lands, what would matter? Why isn't there a state spanning for Northern Europe? Hui, who's a political scientist in Notre Dame, argues that this idea, makes this point that this idea that China is always unified is not true. As you saw in the data I presented, China has been fragmented at some points in history. So she says, look, you can't have a deterministic model. You have to allow for contingencies and random events, and maybe the centralization of China, particularly the initial centralization around the 3rd century BCE, was actually a contingent argument. What we're going to do in this paper, what this paper brings together, is a framework where we can test it. So we need a framework to test these things because they're all plausibly true, and it's difficult to know how we would know whether Jared Diamond is right or Phil Hoffman is right. So you need a framework where you can assess these arguments against each other. Moreover, the arguments which were made by Jared Diamond and the other authors I've discussed are all qualitative arguments. So qualitative arguments are great, but maybe just tell you China is maybe more or less rugged, or has less mountain ranges or more mountain ranges, and it's more or less likely to be unified in Europe. So the qualitative argument tells you the direction of an effect, which is of first order importance. But once you've done that, once you've assessed the argument qualitatively, the next question, and the question that scientists are interested in, is measurement. How much, right? How much more fragmented would China be if it had more mountain ranges? And so quantitative questions, that's what you need to build a model, basically. And so that's what this paper does. So we build a dynamic spatial model of state formation, inspired to some degree by some earlier work, particularly Peter Turchin's paper. And the model is going to encompass the entirety of the globe, but we're primarily focused on Eurasia. So we're going to consider the rest of the world as well. We might have questions about the rest of the world. But our motivation was this China-Europe comparison. So we're going to want to focus on that initially. And the way we're going to go about doing it is dividing the entire area of study, so the entirety of the world, and specifically Eurasia, into very, very, very small grid cells. These grid cells, I think they're 25, 30 kilometers across. So they're like, you can imagine walking across a grid cell in a day. That's how small they are, or at least an army moving across a grid cell in around a day. So they correspond to maybe the smallest possible early forms of political organization. And then we're going to endow each cell with geographical information. So specifically, how rugged is that cell? What is its topography? What is its climate? What is its land productivity? And then we're going to allow these cells to engage in inter- and intrastate competition. Specifically, we're going to think about this as violent competition. And that violent competition is going to give rise to state formation and state consolidation and fragmentation. And there's going to be a large random or stochastic element to this. So the model is very simple and very practical, but it's dealing with a huge amount of information because there's so many small cells. So we have to allow each cell to kind of come into conflict with its rivals, and we can't do that strategically, so we're going to have to allow it to happen stochastically. And so then we can simulate the model and obtain probability distributions over outcomes. So we can say we ask not only does China always become unified, but how often does it become unified in our simulations? And how does that probability of unification change as we vary the components of the model? And so to preview the results, we're going to show you that Joe Diamond's ideas, Hume's ideas, Montague's ideas about fractional land, that do provide a really robust explanation for political divergence we observe that's motivated us so far, this unified China, fragmented Europe. Indeed, fractional land matters. It's so powerful that there are two mechanisms which are on their own actually sufficient. So it's sufficient to consider the topography of Europe versus China. So specifically the location of Europe's mountain ranges, as indeed Diamond kind of argued, creates distinctive geographical cores that provide a nuclei for European states. So either you just think about the topography, the mountain ranges, that's going to predict fragmentation in Europe and not in a single state in China, or you could just think about the distribution of productive land. So particularly the core region of high land productivity in the northern Chinese plain is going to, most of the time, or actually almost always in our simulations, generate a sufficiently strong state in North China that's going to be able to overpower the other states. And that's going to match what we observe about Chinese state formation historically. So Chinese states tended to originate in the north. Similarly, there's an absence of such a core area of high land productivity in Europe. But if we neutralize both of these factors, both topography and productive agricultural land, then we're going to get China and Europe evolving at the same level of political development when it comes to fragmentation versus unification. One of the benefits of doing a model like this is we actually developed a better understanding. Sorry, this is a continuous bunching the monitor. We developed a better understanding of our hypothesis as a result of breaking down this model. So one of the features we see in Europe, which we don't see in other fragmented parts of the world, is a presence of medium-sized states. And as we were writing this paper, Walter Schudel wrote a book called Escape from Rome, where he kind of argued, using more historical, quantitative data and arguments, that Europe's fragmentation, it's not just that Europe's fragmented, Southeast Asia was fragmented, but it's specifically the fragmentation into medium-sized states that distinguishes Europe. These medium-sized states are large enough to kind of have a sufficient level of market development and maybe state capacity, but they're not so large as to dominate their entire region. And actually, in our model, that's indeed what we see. So I think I've said some of this already. We 65,000 hexagons with a radius of 28 kilometers. That's going to span the entire world, but we're going to focus initially on Eurasia. And the way we think about the timing of our model is we think about each period is roughly corresponding to 5 years. And we think about our model as being relevant, most relevant to the time span between the end of the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age, to 1500. After 1500, our model becomes less and less relevant due to new technologies, particularly sailing technologies, which would allow Europeans to kind of colonize other parts of the world. And that's going to make the model less relevant. But our model is trying to fit the data between roughly 1200 BC and 1000 and 1500 AD. And so I'm going to report summary statistics for Europe and China, but in our model, there's nothing distinctive. And so this is our definition of historical China, this is our definition of Europe. We're using the Hadchal line from Trieste to St. Petersburg as a conventional definition of Europe, but nothing in the model stems on Europe or China. These are basically arbitrary divisions. Our model and our results will hold with a much bigger definition of Europe. We would get slightly bigger states, so it would be pretty much quantitatively the same if we included Greece and Scandinavia and other, these parts of Europe. Similarly, we could have a smaller or larger version of China here. It wouldn't affect any of the results I'll show you. We're going to have these hexagons. You saw them actually already here. The world's divided up into these tiny hexagons. Each hexagon is given a value which is from USAID FAO's Global Agroecological Zone Database. So it's a measure of attainable calorific yield under pre-industrial conditions. And it's going to be given geographical attributes such as its ruggedness, so how rugged is the terrain, its climate, those are the important ones basically. And then we're going to make assumptions here in this baseline. Although we can also ignore, we can do without these adjustments. We're going to adjust the soil, whether or not the soil is alluvial, because alluvial soil was easier for farmers with primitive technologies to access. And we're going to allow, so this is basically going to give an advantage early on to places like the Middle East, Mesopotamia, where the soil is particularly easy to cultivate. But that assumption is actually not essential. So this is what the data looks like without any adjustments. This is giving you kind of our measure of calorific yield. So the main thing just to pick up from here is that deserts and cold tundra in Siberia, the areas which are very darkly shaded are not very productive. So you're not going to get early states forming in the Arabian Desert, apart from maybe near oases, or in the Sahara, or in the Himalayas, or in Siberia. But state formation is going to be more likely where the land is highly productive. So bands of high productivity in northern China, in parts of Europe, and in the Ganges plain in India. And some in the Fertile Crescent, though there the climatic changes may be more drastic, which may be something that we will all take care of in some of our working appendices. So I'll go over it. I'll skip that, but just to say that we can use different. We can enrich these data or take things away from them. We're going to get somewhat similar results, but I'm going to show you the baseline where it's taking into account the temperature as well. So extreme temperatures are also bad for early state development. That's the other assumption here. And then ruggedness. So ruggedness is going to be a key determinant of conflict and of state formation. And you can see some parts of you can see the location of the mountains and mountainous areas. It's going to matter for where states emerge in our model. And this is temperature. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll try and explain the simulation. So it's quite straightforward, but it requires it required us to spend some time programming this, particularly like authors rather than me, I have to admit. So each cell is an independent polity. So you begin the world where every single one of these hexagons corresponds to an independent state. And then in each period, conflict can stochastically occur between these adjacent cells. So there's going to be a random probability of conflict. That probability of conflict is going to depend on how productive the land is. So the idea here is that more productive land generates more surplus, and that surplus encourages people to fight over it. If the land is desert, there's nothing to fight over. So they're going to come into contact randomly, and then when they come into contact, there's going to be a battle between them, and that's going to depend on the resources, the productive resources of each cell relative to the other cell, and on the geographical characteristics of a cell being fought over. And so through this process, cells can conquer other cells, and larger states can form. But there can also be secession. So we allow border cells to potentially break away from the states they've been formed into, and that's going to become more likely if there are natural barriers like mountains. That's going to generate more higher probability of secession, and the more border cells state controls, and so it's going to increase the probability of secession. So this model is going to evolve over time, and stochastically, different size shapes are going to emerge or collapse. So this is kind of what it looks like. Hexagon K can come into contact or conflict rather with any of these 6 surrounding cells. And that's going to depend on their productivity. If they come into contact with each other, as I said, they're going to have a battle, and then that battle's resolved according to a contest success function. So you see here, cell K controls the pink cells, and cell K bar controls blue cells, and then with some probability they're going to come into conflict rather on one of their borders. And the result of that battle could be a draw, in which case K does not conquer K bar, and nor vice versa, or it could be the K wins conquers K bar, or it could be the K bar wins and conquers K. And this is just the equation. In the interest of time, I won't spend too much time over it. But what it's saying is the sum of resources so K brings to bear the sum of resources in pink, or the cells in pink. K bar brings to bear the sum of resources in blue, and then it's going to be the sum of K's resources over or relative to the sum of K bar's resources times how difficult it is to fight in that cell. So the idea the defender has an advantage if it's really rugged. And as I said, there are 3 possible outcomes. Either one side answers, the other side answers, or there's also a probability of no conflict, no conquest. And secession is simply more likely if the terrain is more rugged, if the parent regime controls a large number of cells, which means that the state is more heterogeneous, and if there's a longer frontier in that particular polity. So that's going to help us rule out weird shaped polities. So if you think about historical countries, with some exceptions, they tend to form, think about France, right? It's a nice oval kind of shape. It's not like a line. And so we want our model to generate realistic looking states. I won't spend too much time on the details of this, but we also allow for C conflict. But we're very much aware that in the period we're studying, C conflict was rare. So one prominent example actually is the UK or England, which was conquered at several points in the pre-industrial period by the Romans, by the Vikings, by the Normans. So C conflict, conquest over C is possible, but it's harder. And so we just allow for it to be harder, and it's harder the more and more C cells you are separated from each other. So what we have here is we want a model to allow for a polity in what's quote-unquote France to conquer a polity that's in quote-unquote England. But we don't really want China to conquer Japan, though it could happen, but we want that to be less likely. And we definitely don't want polities in India sailing across the Indian Ocean and conquering big empires in Africa, because that doesn't happen historically. We don't want our model to generate unrealistic outcomes like that. So we're going to calibrate our model so that C conflict happens, but it's harder than land conflict. Okay, so this is the timing of the model. There are these cells. Initially, they're all independent, and then each period is some probability of conflict. So, border conflicts are erupting all the time, and they're generating probabilistically state consolidation and state fragmentation. And we're going to choose these parameter values in such a way that we get a model which is well behaved, and that these values kind of make sense and correspond to what we think we observe historically. So we're going to choose values for these key variables such that the model kind of makes sense and that are in line with what we know about pre-industrial conflict. Ensure that our results kind of are well behaved. So I'm just going to walk you through what the model looks like, what the example simulations look like. I'm going to try and run a video, but I know there are people on Teams who are going to be able to see the video. That it's only
they can also watch it from.
Okay, great. It's only going to be 30 seconds, so it's not too short if not. So this is just we've run the simulation many times. You know, for our benchmark, we run everything 50 times and then average it. But I'm just showing you one example. So it generates different results every time you run it. And what we're interested in is pattern prediction. We're not interested in specific, can it generate the borders of France in 1050? That's not what a model like this is designed to do. It's just designed to generate patterns which illuminate our understanding of these historical processes. So this is the model on period 50. So as I said, in period 0, every single state is independent. But every period they're coming into conflict. And there's a probability that they come into conflict, and there's a probability that they go conquer their nearby cells. So what you see here is that in unproductive lands, like deserts, it's still very much, one polity, one cell. Think about this as like, almost hunter-gathering or very simple political organizations. But already in the most productive parts of the world, so the Ganges Plain, the Indus Valley Plain in India, parts of northwest China, parts of Europe, the Middle East around the Fertile Crescent, you are getting large equalities forming. Now, one thing I should add is Egypt and the Middle East are probably underrated by our baseline model because because climatic change and also because of the Nile Valley is unbelievably productive. It's also very narrow and so we might not be fully capturing like early civilizations in the Middle East, but otherwise this is where you see early agriculture and early state formation. So now zoom forward 250 periods, which is about 1,000 years. So think about this as now, maybe the early Middle Ages. So what do we observe? Well, some parts of the world here are still fragmented. The Sahara is still the Sahara, Siberia is still undeveloped, but you have basically China, right? This is kind of China, sort of China. So China is really robust. You always see China. In every single time you run a simulation, we always get China. So in some sense, China being China is easy to generate in our model. It's a very robust outcome of fractured land. So the fact that we have one big kingdom of Eastern and of East Asia seems to be largely explicable in terms of relatively basic geographical information we're feeding a relatively parsimonious model. Similarly, you have like the Northern Indian state. So India in our model doesn't really unify, but that's again in line with history. There's no unified India until the British Empire. So this, you could think about this as a Delhi Sultanate, or maybe the Mughal Empire, or the Gupta Kingdom, however you want to think about it. And you have large-ish, or maybe medium-sized states in the rest of the Near East and Europe. And you can think about this as like, a proto-France, or a proto-Northern Italy, proto-Spain. But as I said, the specific borders don't matter. You're going to get, sometimes you get a France, Germany, and the Carolinian Empire. Sometimes you get like a Byzantine Empire regime where Greece and Italy and parts of Anatolia are ruled by the same polity. It kind of varies randomly as you'd expect. I mean, this is what it looks like by 1500, when you get full consolidation in a really powerful kind of larger China. But in Europe, you just have a consolidation of medium-sized states. So Europe, there's been no real tendency towards centralization in Europe, even though those medium-sized states have perhaps become more consolidated. So that's another one, but I'm going to skip this and maybe show you this and see if this works. Maybe it doesn't work. Let's leave it. So what you have to imagine is you're seeing this, but it goes really quickly for every single period. So it's like changing, and then you get something like this, and then you get something like that. Okay, so this looks like one simulation, but you'll trust my word for it that they generally look a lot like this. And what do we think about these simulations in terms of assessing them assessing them relative to what we observe historically. So, as I've said, the model allows for a lot of historical contingencies, but some results always occur. China always unifies, Europe always remains fragmented into medium-sized polities, not tiny states. What we never see is like a Mongol Empire. So maybe Genghis Khan really was sui generis. He really was like one of a kind. You can see large states in like Central Asia, the Golden Horde, but you never get a Mongol Empire. But you do see other states which look like proto-real states. So you sometimes get a Grand Duchy of Moscow, like a state around Moscow. You sometimes get a very large Poland. So in general, we think this does a good job of simulating state formation in Eurasia. This is now like what happens when we do 30 simulations. So what you see is here is a vanilla vector. This measures like how many states are there in the region of historical China, where one is just one state. And so what we're seeing here is China consolidates fairly early on, but it always, by the end of the simulation, basically approaches almost one. So there's almost always one polity in the entirety of historical China, and there's not much noise around this outcome. In Europe, you see an increase in the H index, the vanilla index, so there's some consolidation, but it kind of flattens out. And it never flattens out anywhere close to 0.6, 0.7, let alone 1. So you never get this tendency towards consolidation in Europe in our baseline model. And now you might think, wow, you've left a lot of stuff out. It's very parsimonious. Would it change if you add in a lot of extra things? But you can add in productive rivers. You can allow for different types of soil to modify the gas data. We also, following Detergent's work, we kind of build on the idea that maybe the steppe was unique. So in particular, steppe nomads have an advantage in terms of conflict because they have horses and horse archers, so we kind of give them an advantage. And it changes things a little bit, but it doesn't change the fundamental results. So yeah, I will just show you some of these. So rivers doesn't change anything. If anything, China consolidates earlier when you allow riverlands to be more productive because of the Yellow and Yangtze are particularly large and important rivers. You can allow the soil quality to matter more, and so then you get China unifying earlier, which is maybe more historically accurate because lowland soil is more productive and China has a lot of it. And you can allow steppe nomads to have an advantage in conflict to see if you can generate steppe empires like the Mongol Empire. And what you do when you do that is you generate, you never generate the Mongol Empire, but you generate regimes which look like other steppe empires, like the empires of the Avars, of the Huns, or the Golden Horde, which span particularly the very productive land of the Ukraine and Central Asia. But you don't get a single Mongol Empire spanning all of them. As you can see, what you get often when you allow the steppe to be more productive is you actually end up giving an advantage to China, and you get something like the Qing Dynasty China, where China expanded into Central Asia. So if anything, allowing the steppe to be more productive makes China stronger again, or unifying earlier. Now, what about China? Well, what about China more carefully? Well, as we've established, Hoffman's claim that China is more mountainous than Europe isn't really the relevant point. What you get from our model is comparing average levels of ruggedness hides all the information. What matters is the distribution of mountains and other geographical obstacles. And so the key thing about China is the mountains are in the west and the south. They then intersect the key fertile plain of North China, which is where you get state formation happening. So what we can do in our model then is we can say what cell, on average in our simulations, where does the empire that conquers China begin? And it turns out that the more common locations for the origins of empire are always in the north, particularly when we allow for lower soil to matter, but it's particularly northwest. And what's interesting is almost all of the unifications of China, beginning at the end of the Warring States period, originate with states in the northwest. And even the one counterexample of the Ming dynasty is, according to Tong, is really a pseudo-counterexample. So most unifications of China originate with northern states. There are almost no real examples of, I think, maybe one example of a southern polity conquering northern China. It's a northern Chinese polity to conquer southern China. And so, yeah, but one pseudo-counter example of this is the Ming dynasty. But all the other unifications come from northern China, beginning with the first emperor in the Qin in the 3rd century BC, and that's also true of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of imperial China in the 17th century. They originated in Manchuria, which is way to the north. And as I've already mentioned, really medium-sized states are crucial in the story. So that's what Shidell argues, that medium-sized states are really be the ideal kind of Goldilocks point that you want for both interstate competition, but not too much fragmentation. So if you're too fragmented, you're always going to be at war with each other, and you're going to be imposing tariffs on each other's regimes. So you want some level of fragmentation, but not too much. And that's the case in Europe. So now we can compare Europe to other parts of the world. And what you see is Europe's kind of in the middle in terms of political fragmentation, in terms of the relative size of states. This is the largest state in Europe. In terms of on both axes the size, this is the second largest, this is the third. So Europe has several states which are comparable. But even more so when you allow for Europe to include Eastern Europe. But in Southeast Asia, yeah, there are loads of states, but they're all tiny. So historically, you know, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they were separate states historically, but they were small and kind of had low state capacity. Whereas Middle East and India, they look a bit more like China in the sense they are dominated by a single state. It's just that state isn't as all-powerful as the Chinese state. So what the model then allows us to do is to do a lot of sensitivity analysis where we can turn things on and off. So here you basically get rid of climate. So you allow all cells to be equally productive regardless of their average temperatures. This makes Europe a bit more productive. And maybe you should have done maybe some more accurate unit. So Europe centralizes a bit more. You get up to a thermal index of 0.3, maybe even touching 0.4 occasionally, but it's still basically the same story. China's unifying, Europe's still fragmented. Similarly, you can get rid of, if you get rid of ruggedness, get rid of the mountains, but you allow the productivity of land to vary, you still get China unifying before Europe, but eventually Europe unifies. Eventually. So you could say, this is kind of like, well, China's still more unified, but Europe does unify as well. That's because we've got rid of all mountain barriers. Similarly, you can make all land equally productive, but keep the mountain barriers, and you still get the baseline predictions, China unifying, Europe fragmenting. It's only when you get rid of everything, get rid of both, get rid of mountains, and make every cell equally productive, then you get China and Europe becoming indistinguishable. That requires turning off both of these things. This is just a different data set of agricultural productivity from Ramakuti et al. We've also got the KKK population demographic data, which is this data where we kind of estimate at a very granular level what the population was around 1000 BC. That gives you the same results. What I'll just do in the final kind of 5 minutes to allow 5 minutes for questions.
If you like, I was worried about 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
So,
okay. I'll wrap this up then. Okay. I'll wrap this up in 2 minutes. So we wanted to write a paper to explain unified China and divided Europe, because that's what the fractional land hypothesis was designed to explain. But in the process of writing it, people kept on saying your model should be able to explain other parts of the world as well. And so we got a lot of this external validity questions. And so what we've done is we've done this model for other parts of the world. And the basic outcome is actually, we think it's very interesting, and we're really glad we did these extensions. But the outcome is it doesn't. But it can do when we modify it suitably. So just to give you the summarized version, Africa, for reasons we know from other scholars, from a lot of scholars, sub-Saharan Africa is just different. Why is it different? Well, the disease environment is just tremendously harder for humans at the state formation. The tsetse fly kills livestock. Livestock are crucial for the development of early states. Malaria is a terrible disease which basically really impedes productivity. So sub-Saharan Africa, based on our model, it should generate states earlier and in stronger states than it does, but the reasons it doesn't have to do with things we know about, such as malaria and tsetse fly. Similarly, in the Americas, based on modern estimates of land productivity, you should see more state formation than you do, but really they weren't able to plant maize in North America. So we know now that North America is great agricultural land, but there were no farmers really in the northern part of the Americas, and that's partly because they didn't have iron tools to cut down the forest. Once you cut down the forest in Virginia, the farmland is great, but it's really dense forest, so they didn't have agriculture. So when you do that, we get kind of the model, corresponds to what we see historically, with just a few relatively fragmentary weak states in Africa. And similarly, in the Americas, the only states we really observe are in central Mexico and in Peru, not in places like the Amazon rainforest or what's now USA. So yeah, I can conclude now and say that we've built a simple model of conflict and political competition, and we've used that model to kind of model the role of fraction land, productivity and terrain in mediating interstate conflict. And then we try to use that model to guide our thinking about kind of European and Chinese or Eurasian history over a very long span. So in a very longue durée, zoomed out fashion, what's going on in the pattern of state formation across pre-industrial history. And what we show is that the fraction land hypothesis is really powerful, so it's geography plus interstate competition and geopolitical competition that explains a lot of the different patterns we see across Eurasia.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So there might be some questions on Teams, but to start with, questions.
Final question.
Yeah, first. Yeah.
Well, sure.
Oh.
So my question is pretty simple. You're going from no states or states of oneself to these empires. You're very good. It seems almost monotonistic, right? That you're monotonically increasing, right? You more states every year, but we know that wasn't the case. We know that there's collapses. What explains collapses? Are they exogenous to the model? And how does your model then deal with collapse?
That's a great question. I had answers in another slide, so which are not here. So two things. The secession does generate breakdowns of states. So you can get, say a state gets conquered, some cells get conquered by another state, that can then render the shape of that state which was defeated less tenable, because it's now got more borders. And so then you get more likely for that state to secede. But to generate what we might observe historically, we have to then exogenously add in crises. So you can think about what are the climate changes? Like, we know climate change is important in the fall of the Roman Empire, and Chinese dynasties were overthrown when there were a lot of natural disasters or famine. So we can put in stochastic shocks. And we do that in two different ways. But what we see is in China, then even in China, the state breaks down. So in our model, the Chinese state never breaks down. Historically, it does. So we need exogenous shocks to explain it. But even if we allow those exogenous shocks, the basic story is the same. It always reunifies. There's no path dependency in the sense that you can break down, China can collapse. It will always become China again. But Europe,
probability of this coefficient is actually zero, truly zero, given the result is less than 5%. You're just showing me pictures. Is there any way to statistically say, we've got this model down and we reject the probability that this is just noise? and just giving me pretty pictures that my brain is deciding to say look like Europe, that it's my interpretation of the maps?
That's a good question. We thought about this, but we haven't got. So you might think there's some way to get a map and statistically measure goodness of fit. It's hard to decide what year you should pick. So our response to some of that type of question is to say that what we're generating is pattern predictions. It's like the Hayekian phrase, not specific. We can predict the borders of France in 1400. So, but you're right. So what I would say first of all is that the patterns are aligned on that. These are distributions drawn from 30. These are 30 because we found 30 doesn't. We've done 200. Takes weeks to run. We've done 200 simulations, and this is the error bar basically around China. So you're basically, they're pretty tight error bars. Errors.
Yeah, well, the simulation that I saw doesn't really explain the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And I would like to differentiate between also conquering and maintaining and keeping that empire, because in terms of landscape, it's even more difficult landscape to navigate. It's across the Mediterranean through mountain ranges. And it lasted for 600 years, and it started from a single city, Rome, conquering bigger countries like Macedonian kingdoms in Syria and Egypt, and keeping that empire for 600 years, only to fall because, again, geography, exposure from, higher exposure to invasion from the north than China, that essentially China only had the Mongols, and nobody else around it to do it. China had the Japanese much later on. The Japanese industrialized themselves and did conquer and kept part of China as well, but you're not dealing with that kind of technology. If we go back, however, to Rome, it's a miracle how Rome happened and maintained.
Exactly. I was looking to see if I had my other slides. I don't. So we talked. So you're right, and we have been in trouble. Well, this is it's a tiny at that point, but we haven't thought about it a lot actually. So it's in the paper, the appendix, how to think about Rome. So we've done several things. I'm just trying to think about the most concise way to give you the answer there, which is. We've said one of the minimum things to generate a Mediterranean-sized empire. So what do we need to do to a model to generate something like Rome? Because Rome never appears in any baseline, never. And so there are two things you can try to do, but these also don't fully generate it. So one is the Mediterranean in our model is treated like any other sea. But actually, as you'll know, the Mediterranean is more traversable than any other sea. And so you could basically make the Mediterranean a lake. Assume the Mediterranean is a lake, and make it easier to conquer cells across the Mediterranean. That on its own doesn't generate Rome. It just generates larger states either side. It makes Carthage or Macedon larger. Then the other thing you can do is based on the work of Kyle Harper, but other people as well, which is to say, Kyle Harper's argument is there's a Roman climatic optimum. So basically, the Roman Empire rose when the Mediterranean was both much wetter than it is today and warmer. So that's why North Africa was a breadbin in Roman times. The land was just super productive. And we know that cultivated land in North Africa extended way further south than it does now. So these two things help, but we still don't quite generate Rome. And so when we talked to classicists like Walter Schedel, and they basically we said, okay, now we're going to make Rome special on another dimension, which is better at fighting.
But fighting doesn't keep the empire. I mean, what about institutions? I didn't hear the word institutions.
Yeah, so we're here in the model. Once you conquer the empire, once you conquer an empire in the model, once you conquer the empire, it has some properties of stability. So in the simulation where we can try, I should say, the closest you can get to Rome is a Mediterranean kind of empire. Even our Rome, quote unquote Rome, will never conquer Northern Europe. So we never get a Julius Caesar getting Gaul. But in the model, once you conquer the large enough empire, then you kind of become pretty robust. Unless barring these exogenous stochastic shocks we do, which we haven't combined the stochastic shocks with Rome. So maybe we should combine those two extensions. But once you get a big empire, you get big, yeah. And so in our model, there are no institutions. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to think about just one thing, which is the fragmentation and centralization. Think about that as an outcome. And that's kind of an institutional, that has institutional connotations. And we're trying to explain that with a geography. So just to finish, when I think about, Asimov Robinson in their book kind of say, there's institutions explanations, there are geographical explanations, and there are cultural explanations. Think about these as isolated. And I always thought about, no, geography can matter, but it might matter through institutions. So I don't think the fact that we focus on geography here means that we're throwing out institutions.
I think we're probably out of time if you want to get that train.
Yeah, you're right,
So,
actually, yeah.
Yes.
I'm really sorry, guys, yeah.
But we're going to have a quick word afterwards. But thank you very much, Mark. It was a really, really great talk. Yeah, a fantastic paper. So great.